My mother left me for dead, and now years later, now that I have money, she is back and wants my help. Subject, welcome to the Hanoi Survival Guide. I commented the gist of my story on here earlier, and many said they want to hear the whole thing, so I'll try, but like I said, it's going to be long. Also, you don't have to feel bad for me because I definitely don't anymore, so don't worry. Okay, so we're back, or rather, I'm back. You? You're just some random person on the internet, possibly doom scrolling your way through life. Don't worry, I'm right there with you. Except instead of memes, I've got my tragic comedy to share. Welcome to the show. Let's talk about my mother. You know how people say their moms are their best friends? Or their heroes? Yeah, mine wasn't. Mine was the kind of woman who made telenovelas look like mild inconveniences. She was drama personified, a storm wrapped in cheap perfume and bad decisions. It all happened when I was 5. But trust me, even at 5, some things burn into your brain like the stench of durian on a hot day. The day she left, that wasn't just some quiet exit. No, my mom didn't do quiet. She didn't just slip out in the middle of the night with a suitcase and leave a note on the table. Nah, she went for the full Vietnamese soap opera exit. She came home one day with this man. Some guy, not my dad. He looked rich. You could always tell by the way they dressed. My dad at the time was probably at the local market selling construction supplies or drinking coffee and lamenting how his life wasn't going according to plan. And here was this guy in my house, standing there with my mother like he owned the place. I don't know what 5-year-old me thought. I probably thought he was just some friend or business associate. Turns out he was her way out. I don't remember how long this was going on, but eventually she decided to stop with the whole charade and leave. But she didn't just leave. She yelled. I'm talking screaming, like one of those shouting matches that gets the whole neighborhood's attention. She told my dad that she was done. Done with the struggle, done with the poverty, done with him. She pointed at him like he was some bug that crawled in through the cracks in the wall. You think I'm going to waste my life being poor? She yelled. I'm done living in this rat hole. And my dad, he just stood there frozen like someone had taken his spine and ripped it out. Culturally in Vietnam, family is everything. Men are supposed to be the providers, the ones who keep everything together. My dad couldn't do that. And she made sure he knew it. In front of me, in front of the man she was leaving with, in front of anyone within a 5-mile radius who could hear her. She packed her things. I watched her walk out the door with this man I didn't know, leaving me standing there next to my dad, who had all the life drained out of him. You want to know the worst part? She didn't even look back. Not at me, not at him. Nothing. I guess she figured we weren't worth the effort. We weren't part of her new life, her new plan. She left us behind like old shoes she didn't want to wear anymore. That was the last time I saw her. I was 5, but I remember the sound of her voice as she walked out the door, like an echo that never stopped bouncing around in my head. Subject, Life After the Storm, my dad's slow death. Now, if this were a movie, my dad would have had some kind of redemption arc. He would have picked himself up, focused on raising me, and maybe we'd have been okay. But that's not what happened. Instead, my dad went the other way. It wasn't immediate. He didn't collapse into a drunken mess the moment she left, but he started drinking more. At first, it was just a beer after work, then a few more after dinner, and then there was no work and no dinner, just the drinking. By the time I was 6, he wasn't my dad anymore. He was a ghost of himself, haunted by the fact that he couldn't keep his family together. Vietnamese culture puts a lot of pressure on men to be providers. If you can't provide, you're nothing. My dad couldn't provide anymore, so he just stopped trying. The construction business dried up. He stopped going to work, stopped caring. He'd sit at home all day, drunk, staring at the walls or the ceiling or whatever was in front of him. Here's the copied text as requested. Our neighbors, they didn't say much. Maybe they pitied him, or maybe they just didn't want to get involved. In Vietnam, you don't really talk about your problems. You just deal with them or you don't. But no one's going to come over and ask you if you're okay. They'd rather gossip about you behind your back. That's the cultural way. So we slipped into poverty. The kind of poverty that makes you realize just how little you have when there's no one left to help you. I was too young to understand what was happening, but I knew it wasn't good. Our house started falling apart. Bills didn't get paid. Food became this weird luxury, like something you only had if the universe was feeling generous. And my dad, he just got angrier at himself, at the world, at me. I'll never forget the night he died. It's etched into my memory like a scar that never fully heals. He was drunk, as usual. He'd been drinking since the morning, yelling about something. I don't even remember what. Maybe it was the broken TV, maybe it was the fact that we had no money, or maybe it was just because he was angry and drunk and didn't know what else to do. He started screaming at me about how everything was my fault, about how if I hadn't been born, maybe none of this would have happened. I didn't even argue. What could I say? I was 6, standing there, taking it because that's what I did. I'd gotten used to it. And then he collapsed. At first, I didn't know what was happening. He was on the ground, clutching his chest, still screaming, but the words didn't make sense. His face turned red, then white, and then nothing. Silence. Just the sound of his breath, or what was left of it, slowing down. He was dead before I even knew what that meant. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, staring at his body, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. The neighbors came over eventually, but not because they cared. They came because they wanted to know what the yelling was about. They found him on the floor, me standing over him, and called the police. I don't remember much after that. The police took him away. Someone came to collect his things, and that was it. No funeral, no goodbyes. Just another dead man in a city that was too busy to notice. After that, I was on my own. Vietnam isn't the kind of place where people jump in to help an orphan kid. If you don't have family, well, good luck. The government, they're too busy dealing with more important things. And our culture, it's all about survival of the fittest. You don't beg for help, you make do. So that's what I did. I made do. I wandered around the streets of Hanoi, begging for food when I could, stealing when I couldn't. You think people would help a kid on the street, right? Wrong. Most people didn't even notice me. Some were annoyed, others were downright hostile. A few tossed me some coins or a bit of bread, but for the most part, I was invisible. Hanoi is beautiful in its own way. Tourists love the old quarter, with its winding streets and old French architecture. But that's not where I was. I was in the back alleys, the places tourists don't go, the places where people like me, street kids, blend into the background. There's a kind of code on the streets. You don't trust anyone, but you stick together when it's convenient. I made friends with other kids like me, orphans, runaways, kids whose parents had thrown them out because they were too much to handle. We looked out for each other, but only to a point. There was no loyalty, no trust, just survival. I took whatever I'd find. Washing dishes in the back of restaurants, sweeping streets, carrying crates at the market. The work was hard, but it paid, sort of. Most of the time, the pay was food or a place to sleep. That's just how it was. You don't argue, you don't complain, you take what you're given and hope it's enough to get you through the day. There was this one job, I was maybe 9 or 10, working for a market vendor. He sold fruit, and I was supposed to help carry the crates, keep the stall clean, like that kind of thing. He was a mean old guy, yelled a lot, hit me if I didn't move fast enough. But he paid me in bananas, so I didn't care. I figured that was as good as it was going to get. Then one day, a crate of apples went missing. I didn't steal it, but he didn't care. He accused me anyway, said I'd been sneaking food when he wasn't looking. He hit me so hard I couldn't see straight, then told me to get lost. That was it. Job gone, no explanation, no second chance. That's how it was in the streets. You worked until you didn't, until someone decided you weren't useful anymore, or you pissed them off, or they found someone cheaper. You never stayed anywhere long. You never trusted anyone. Subject, the faux shop, more yelling, less food. Eventually, I ended up working at this faux shop. I was maybe 14 by then, which made me practically a veteran at surviving. The owner was a real piece of work. Old guy, probably in his 60s, and just angry all the time. I think the only thing he loved was his pho. He hated his customers, hated his employees, and definitely hated me. He paid me next to nothing, of course. But I didn't care. I wasn't there for the money. I was there for the pho. A bowl a day, that's what he promised me. And when you're starving, a bowl of pho is better than gold. The work was brutal. I was the dishwasher, the cleaner, the delivery boy, and whatever else he needed me to be. If I screwed up, he'd hit me, same as all the others. Culturally in Vietnam, hitting your employees wasn't exactly frowned upon back then. It was just how things were. You didn't complain. You didn't fight back. You just took it. There was another guy who worked there too. Long, I think his name was. He was a few years older than me, and he was just as miserable as I was. He'd been working at the faux shop for years, and he had that same beaten down look in his eyes that I was starting to develop. We never talked much, just did our jobs, kept our heads down, and tried not to piss off the boss. One day, Long didn't show up for work. The boss didn't ask where he was. He just found some other kid to take his place. That's how it went. One day, you're there. The next, you're gone, and no one cares. Subject, life's a massage until you get thrown out. So let's talk about one of the finer things in life. No, not money. I hadn't figured that part out yet. I'm talking about massages. If you live in Vietnam long enough, you know massages are as much a part of daily life as pho or café suada. They're cheap everywhere, and after working 12 hours straight on your feet, they feel like a blessing from the gods, or so I thought. One day I saved up enough from all my miserable jobs to treat myself to a massage. I figured, why not? It's one of the few luxuries I could actually afford. You get a massage, you leave feeling like a human again. Seemed simple enough. I went to one of those tiny hole-in-the-wall places. Nothing fancy, just a cramped little room, an old fan humming in the corner, and a massage table that looked like it had seen better days. But hey, you get what you pay for, right? The girl who came in to do the massage, let's just say she wasn't exactly there for the professional experience. She got right to the point, no pretense. After about 5 minutes of awkward back rubs, she leaned in and asked me if I wanted more. I didn't need a translator for that one. Culturally, Vietnam's got this weird duality where traditional values clash with this underground world of hustling and survival. She was clearly in survival mode. Now look, I wasn't exactly rolling in dong, the currency, just to clarify, but I figured, why not? I gave her a little extra. Well, that was my first mistake. Instead of, giving me what I paid for, she pocketed the cash, smiled like I was her new favorite customer, and then promptly walked out of the room. I sat there waiting, like some kind of idiot, thinking maybe she went to grab something. 5 minutes later, a different girl walked in. Same uniform, same fake smile, different face. She didn't even bother with the pretense, just started the massage like nothing had happened. I asked her where the other girl went, and all I got was a shrug and a "Kong bit, don't know." Right, I should have seen it coming. They tag-teamed me and split the money. Classic. I tried to complain, but that didn't exactly go well. The owner, a big, grumpy woman who looked like she'd wrestled water buffalo for fun, came in all scowl and no patience. She didn't want to hear my complaints. She just wanted me out of her shop and fast. Next thing I knew, I was being physically thrown out, half naked, onto the street. And that, my friends, was the first and last time I ever tried to get a massage. Subject, jobs, where dreams go to die, and sometimes you too. But let's get back to the real story. The jobs. You'd think by now I'd have learned that trusting people was a bad idea, but no, I hadn't. I still believed that maybe, just maybe, someone would give me a break. Spoiler, they didn't. There was this one place, a market stall that sold rice. The owner was a sleazebag, a typical Ongchu boss who thought of his workers as disposable. He paid us in rice, which was fine, I guess. At least I wasn't starving. The other kids I worked with, they were in the same boat. Poor, desperate, just trying to get through the day without getting slapped or cheated. There was one kid, let's call him Kwa. We weren't friends, not really, because friends were a liability. But we worked together, and that made him the closest thing I had to a partner in crime. He was maybe a year or two older than me, though he looked about 20 years older from the exhaustion and the constant abuse we dealt with. We got through it by sharing what little we had. You split the rice, you cover each other's shifts when the boss wasn't looking, you trade stories about how miserable your life is. Real heartwarming stuff. One day, Kwa just collapsed, right there in the middle of the stall, surrounded by bags of rice. No warning, no buildup. He just hit the ground and didn't get back up. I remember the look on the boss's face. No concern, no panic, just annoyance. He didn't care that Koa was lying there unconscious, probably dying. He just cared that his worker was down. Less labor for him. Get him out of here, he said. Like Koa was a broken tool instead of a human being. No one even bothered to call for help. They just dragged him out into the alley like yesterday's trash. I don't know what happened to Koa after that. No one does. He didn't come back and no one asked about him. I guess he died. Or maybe he just wandered off like so many others before him. Either way, he was gone, and just like that, I realized something. I couldn't do this anymore. I'd spent my whole life getting kicked around, working for people who didn't care whether I lived or died. Watching Koa collapse like that made me realize something important. If I kept going the way I was, I'd end up just like him. Another nameless face on the street, another forgotten casualty in a city that didn't give a damn about me. So I decided I wasn't going to wait for someone else to give me a break. I was going to make my own. I didn't know how. I didn't have a plan, but I was done being everyone's punching bag. If I was going to die, I was going to die on my own terms. And if I was going to live, well, then I was going to find a way to make sure no one could ever treat me like that again. That's when the idea hit me. I was going to start my own business. It wasn't some grand life-changing moment. I didn't suddenly have an epiphany and know exactly what I was going to do. I just knew I needed to stop working for people who treated me like dirt. I needed to be the one in charge, even if that meant scraping by for a while longer. But starting a business in Hanoi when you've got nothing but the shirt on your back? Yeah, that's easier said than done. I didn't have money, I didn't have connections, I didn't have any of the things you need to succeed. What I did have was a lifetime of experience in surviving. And that's worth more than any degree or fancy business plan. I started small. I found a tiny corner of the market, literally a corner, just a little space between two vendors where no one was set up. It wasn't much, but it was free. I started fixing electronics, phones, radios, whatever people brought me. I wasn't an expert, but I knew enough from working at various shops to get by. And in Vietnam, if you can fix things, people will pay you. Not a lot, but enough. At first, it was slow. I'd sit there for hours with no customers, just watching the hustle and bustle of the market around me. People haggling, vendors shouting, tourists looking lost. It was a symphony of chaos, and I was just a small, unnoticed part of it. But then, word started to spread. Someone came to me with a broken phone, and I fixed it. They told their friend, who told their friend, and before I knew it, I had a small but steady stream of customers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me fed, enough to keep me alive. I didn't trust anyone, not after everything I'd been through. I worked alone, kept my head down, and focused on doing the job. I wasn't interested in making friends or connections. I was just trying to survive. Even though I was working for myself now, the streets weren't any kinder. If anything, they were harsher. Other vendors saw me as competition, even though I was barely making enough to get by. There were times when I'd come back to my little corner and find my tools had been stolen or my space taken by someone else. That's just how it was. Survival of the fittest. There was this one guy, let's call him Min, who sold counterfeit electronics a few stalls down from me. Min was the kind of guy who'd sell you a brand new phone for a tenth of the price and then disappear before you realized it didn't work. He had a small gang of guys working for him, and they weren't shy about using force to get what they wanted. One day, Min's guys came over to my little corner. They didn't say much, just knocked over my table, scattered my tools, and told me I needed to move along. They weren't asking, they were telling. In the nicest way possible, of course. I didn't argue. What was the point? I wasn't going to win that fight. I just packed up what was left of my stuff and found another spot. That's how it was. You either moved or you got moved. No point in getting angry about it. That was just life. But every time something like that happened, every time someone tried to push me down or steal what little I had, it just made me more determined. I wasn't going to give up. Not after everything I'd been through. I'd lost too much already. My childhood, my dignity. I wasn't going to lose this too. So I kept going, kept grinding, kept surviving. Because that's what you do when the world doesn't care about you. You find a way to make it care, or at least to make sure it doesn't forget you exist. Subject: From begging to thriving, how I went from street kid to business owner, and now my mother wants a favor. All right, so picking up from where I left off, business was slow, real slow. If you've ever sat in the middle of a busy Hanoi market for hours just waiting for a single customer to walk by and notice you, you know the kind of slow I'm talking about. I'd sit there, half covered in sweat, listening to the relentless noise of the market, watching people pass me by like I was invisible. At first, I thought I could make it just by being useful to the locals, fix their phones, TVs, radios, whatever they brought me. And sure, I had a few regulars, but the truth is, people in the market didn't want to spend much. They'd rather buy something new and cheap than fix something old. And when you're a no name kid in a sea of other vendors, well, it's hard to stand out. So I had to think outside the box. And by box, I mean outside the typical Vietnamese customer. That's when I started noticing the tourists. Hanoi's full of them. They come in waves, swarming the old quarter, snapping photos, and getting lost in alleyways like they're in some kind of magical labyrinth. And let me tell you something, tourists are clueless, completely clueless. They'll pay 3 times as much for something because they don't know what it's actually worth. They don't haggle like the locals do. They just hand over their money and hope for the best. That's when I realized if I was going to survive, I had to pivot. Forget the locals. I was going to cater to tourists, especially the Westerners. And of all the tourists, the Americans were the ones who stuck out to me. Not just because they're loud, though they are, but because they have this attitude that's hard to ignore. There's this whole never give up thing they've got going on. I watch them laugh off being lost, shrug off bad meals, and just keep pushing forward. That kind of blind optimism, I didn't have it, but I figured if I could channel even a bit of that energy into my business, I might be able to make something happen. So I started learning English, slowly, painfully. At first, I barely knew enough to say hello, but I listened, I watched. I picked up phrases here and there from the tourists who came by. I'd overcharge them a bit for repairs, but they didn't mind. They just seemed relieved to find someone who could help. And over time, I got better at speaking. I stopped needing translations as much and could carry on basic conversations. I wasn't fluent by any stretch, but I was functional. And in business, functional is enough to get you by. Years passed, and I kept working with tourists. I expanded from fixing electronics to selling custom built phones and other gadgets. I started importing parts from overseas and even dabbled in some tech consulting for tourists who were moving to Vietnam long term. My business grew, slowly at first, but eventually it started to take off. By then, I could speak English well enough that I didn't need to rely on anyone to help me. Americans, in particular, loved my shop. They liked that I understood them, or at least tried to. I became the go-to guy for expats and tourists alike. My little corner stall turned into a proper shop, and that shop turned into 2, then 3. Before I knew it, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I had employees, I had a real business. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just scraping by. I was comfortable. Subject. The day she came back. I thought my past was behind me. I had built a life, built something out of nothing. And then, one day, my past walked right through the front door of my store. I didn't recognize her face. Years had passed and she was older now, worn down by life in ways I couldn't have imagined. But I knew that voice. The second I heard it, something inside me froze. It was like hearing an old, terrible song you thought you'd forgotten, only to realize every note is burned into your brain. It was my mother. She walked in like any other customer, oblivious to the fact that the shop she was standing in was mine. She didn't recognize me, and why would she? I was just a kid the last time she saw me. To her, I was probably long gone, a chapter she closed when she walked out the door all those years ago. She was here for help, of course. What else would she be here for? The irony wasn't lost on me. After abandoning me and leaving me to fend for myself, now she was back and she needed my help. She asked to see someone who could fix her phone, not even sparing me a second glance. To her, I was just one of the employees. I played along at first, I don't know why. Maybe part of me wanted to see how far this would go. I took her phone, listened to her complain about how terrible the service was, how no one could help her, and how the least I could do was not waste her time. She snapped her fingers at me like I was a servant, not knowing that I owned the place. not knowing I had built it from nothing while she was off living whatever life she had chosen. The longer I stood there, the more I realized I couldn't keep it up. There was too much anger, too much history between us for me to just be polite, so I told her. "I'm the owner," I said, watching her face for a reaction, "and I'm your son." The look on her face? Priceless. For a second, she didn't believe me. Then, slowly, the realization dawned. Her eyes widened, her mouth dropped open, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I saw fear, or maybe guilt. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes. "You?" she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "How? How am I still here?" I cut her off. "How did I survive after you walked out? You left me. You left Dad, and now you come back, expecting me to help you like nothing happened?" She stammered, trying to come up with something, some excuse, some explanation, but there wasn't one. Not really. She knew it. I knew it. There was nothing she could say to make any of it okay. I threw her out. Not physically, but I told her to leave. I wasn't the kid she abandoned anymore. I was the one in control now, and I didn't need her. I watched her leave, cursing under her breath, but before she walked out the door, she turned back. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I didn't know." We exchanged information. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me thought I'd want to contact her one day. Maybe some part of me still felt like a son, even if I didn't want to admit it. She left, and that was that, or so I thought. Subject: now she wants help, of course. Years passed. I kept working, kept building. My business grew even more. I started hiring more staff, opening new locations. I was doing well, better than I ever imagined. Life had finally settled into something resembling normalcy. And then, out of nowhere, I got the call. It was her again. My mother. I hadn't heard from her since the day I threw her out of the shop. This time, though, she wasn't just asking for help with a broken phone. She was dying. Some illness. She didn't go into detail, but it was bad. And she needed money. She needed help. The woman who abandoned me when I was 5. The woman who never looked back, never cared what happened to me, never tried to find me until she needed something. Now she was asking for my help. She didn't even try to sugarcoat it. She just said she needed money, that she had no one else, and that I was her son, so I should help her. And here's the thing. I don't know what to do. Some part of me wants to help her, not because I forgive her, but because some cultural instinct is telling me that family is family, no matter what. In Vietnam, you're taught that blood ties are important. No matter how much someone hurts you, they're still your family. There's this unspoken rule that you don't turn your back on them, even if they turn theirs on you. But the other part of me, the part that remembers standing in that room, listening to her scream at my father, watching her walk out the door without a second thought, that part wants to tell her to go to hell. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has the answer. Maybe I just needed to get this out because it's eating away at me. She's dying, and she's asking for my help, and the only thing I can think about is how she left me to die when I was just a kid. What do I owe her? Anything? Nothing? I don't know. All I know is that for the first time in a long time, I feel like that kid again, lost, alone, and wondering what the hell I'm supposed to do now. But that's ultimately why I started writing this whole thing, since many people share their issues here. It's been a long ride, and I appreciate all the comments and feedback I received. I'm still very much torn and not sure what to do. I think I'll read over your comments again and meditate on it. Thank you.